Hello again, Psych 370 students, and welcome to another video lecture for week 11. In this one, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the fixed ratio, or FR, schedule of reinforcement. Now guys, first of all, remember, like I talked about in my last video lecture, with a fixed ratio schedule, that's where each reinforcer occurs after a set, fixed, unchanging number of responses have been made. So continuous reinforcement is actually just a specific type of fixed ratio schedule. It's what we call an FR1 schedule. It's a fixed ratio schedule where the number of required responses for each reinforcer is one, because again, on a continuous schedule of reinforcement, every single response that the animal makes is followed by the reinforcer. So in other words, with continuous reinforcement, there is a 1-to-1 ratio of responses to reinforcers. Every one response produces the reinforcer. But of course, that number doesn't have to be one. It could be anything. So for example, if a coffee shop runs a special where you get a free coffee after you buy 5 coffees first, then that would be an FR5 schedule. Every 5th response produces the reinforcer. Or if you got a rat pressing a bar in a Skinner box, then you could set it up so that every 12th bar press gets reinforced. You could put that rat on an FR12 schedule. Or you could make it so that every 100th bar press gets reinforced, an FR100 schedule, and so on. But either way, whatever the exact size of the ratio is, once an animal has gotten accustomed to that fixed ratio schedule, its responding usually stabilizes into the pattern that you're seeing on this cumulative record. So on fixed ratio schedules, there's a high rate of responding until the ratio has been completed. And then after the reinforcer has been delivered, there's a little pause where the animal sort of takes a break and doesn't make the response again for a little while. So in other words, we see this sort of stop and go pattern in the cumulative record with fixed ratio schedules. The animal stops after it gets each reinforcer. There's that pause in responding, which is indicated by this little flat section in the cumulative record, and then it goes. So after the pause, it responds rapidly again until it completes the next ratio. So you get this sort of step ladder look in the cumulative record with fixed ratio schedules. Now, guys, this break that the animal takes after each reinforcer is called a post-reinforcement pause, okay? Or at least it's traditionally been called a post-reinforcement pause. I'll have more to say about that later. And then the rate of responding that the animal exhibits once it goes back to work after the pause is called the run rate. So I need to say a little bit here about run rates and post-reinforcement pauses. First of all, one thing to know about post-reinforcement pauses is that the larger the ratio is of responses to reinforcers, the longer that post-reinforcement pause tends to be. So with very small ratios, like you'd have on, say, an FR1 or FR2 schedule, we see very short pauses or none at all. But as you increase how much you're demanding from the animal for each reinforcer, as you increase the size of the ratio so that you're requiring more responses for each reinforcer, that pause gets longer and longer. So the size of the ratio, the number of required responses, that does have an effect on the length of the post-reinforcement pause. However, the size of the ratio typically doesn't have an effect on the animal's run rate. In other words, after each post-reinforcement pause, when the animal starts making the response again, it tends to perform that response just as rapidly, regardless of whether it's on an FR10 schedule, an FR100 schedule, an FR200 schedule, or whatever the case may be. So basically, with bigger ratios, the animal tends to take longer to go back to work after it gets a reinforcer. But then once it does, it typically works just as quickly. It performs that response just as rapidly as it would with a smaller ratio. And I've illustrated both of those tendencies on these cumulative records here. So as you can see, with the bigger ratio on the right, the flat parts of the line are longer, indicating longer post-reinforcement pauses. But in between those flat parts, the lines in both of these cumulative records are parallel to each other. They have the same slope, which indicates that the same run rate is occurring on both of those schedules. Okay, so again, on fixed ratio schedules, we get this sort of stop and go pattern with pauses after each reinforcer and a high run rate, a high rate of responding once the animal goes back to responding after the pause. And it makes sense that we'd see a high run rate on fixed ratio schedules. It makes sense that we'd see the animal performing the response rapidly, because with any ratio schedule, the faster you make the response, then the faster you're going to complete that ratio and the faster you're going to get your next reinforcer. But what's traditionally been a little tougher for researchers to explain are these post reinforcement pauses that the animal makes. So, why does it do that? Because it doesn't have to, right? It could go right back to work after it gets each reinforcer. It doesn't have to pause like that. And it's actually counterproductive for it to make these pauses because it winds up getting fewer reinforcers in the long run as a result. So, what's going on with these pauses? Well, guys, there are basically two competing explanations here. And they're both consistent with the fact that, as I just mentioned, we tend to see longer pauses with bigger ratios. So it could be that once the animal has completed a ratio, it's just tired. So fatigue could explain why it takes that little break and it's responding. But it could also be that the animal is sort of procrastinating, right? So, in other words, after it completes one ratio, the animal knows that there's a lot of work ahead of it before it can get its next reinforcer. So maybe it takes the break in order to sort of psych itself up before it goes and does that work. So that's another idea. I guess the more technical name for that procrastination idea is the remaining responses hypothesis. Okay. Meaning that the pause occurs because after you get a reinforcer on a fixed ratio schedule, that's when you're the farthest away from your next reinforcer, right? That's when you have the most responses remaining. It's when you have the most work left to do before you can get reinforced again. So we've got the fatigue hypothesis, and then we've got this remaining responses hypothesis. Is it that animals are tired, or is it that they're sort of procrastinating? Now, before I can tell you about how research has gone about testing between those hypotheses, I need to tell you first about what we call a multiple schedule of reinforcement. Okay, these are known as multiple schedules of reinforcement. And as the name suggests, a multiple schedule is where you're reinforcing a particular response on more than one schedule. So you have different schedules in effect at different times for that response. Sometimes the response is being reinforced on one schedule, other times it's being reinforced on a different schedule. And guys, which schedule is operating at any given time is signaled by a particular stimulus. Okay, so on a multiple schedule of reinforcement, the animal can tell which schedule is in place based on which stimulus is present. So, for example, if you have a pigeon picking a key in a Skinner box for food, then you might put that pigeon on a multiple schedule where if a red light is turned on, then it gets the food after every 10 pecks. And if a blue light is turned on, then it gets the food after every 100 pecks. So the red light is a discriminative stimulus that indicates that the FR10 schedule is in effect. And the blue light is a discriminative stimulus that indicates that the FR100 schedule is in effect. Okay, so that's how a multiple schedule works. Now, of course, the different schedules in a multiple schedule don't have to both be the same kind of schedule. Okay, they don't have to both be fixed ratio schedules or whatever. They could be anything. So you could have one fixed interval schedule and one variable ratio schedule. You could have a multiple schedule where one schedule is variable interval and the other one is fixed ratio or whatever. What defines a multiple schedule of reinforcement is just that there are at least two different schedules. Those schedules sort of take turns, they alternate, different schedules are in effect at different times, and each schedule is signaled by a particular stimulus. Now, having said that, in the research that we need to talk about here to understand whether these pauses are due to fatigue or to procrastination, we are looking at multiple schedules that do include two fixed ratio schedules, one with a smaller ratio and one with a larger ratio. So for example, this diagram illustrates the typical pattern that we'd see after an animal has had some experience with a multiple schedule like the one I just described, where a blue light indicates that a longer FR100 schedule is in effect, and a red light indicates that a shorter FR10 schedule is in effect. So, guys, the way to read this is whenever a reinforcer is delivered, that's indicated down here on the bottom line. Periods of responding appear as solid black bars on the middle line. So, pauses in responding appear as white space here. And then on the top line, we're looking at which discriminative stimulus is in place, the blue light or the red light. And guys, the thing to notice here is that it isn't the size of the previous ratio that determines how long of a pause the animal takes. So for example, at points A and D here, the animal has just completed these long 100 response ratios, right? So even though the light has changed to red, indicating a switch to the FR10 schedule, the fatigue hypothesis would predict that because the animal has just worked so hard to complete that previous ratio, it should take fairly long pauses at both of those points. But as you can see, it doesn't do that. Those pauses are pretty short. Furthermore, at points C and E, the animal has just completed these short 10 response ratios there, right? So if the fatigue hypothesis is correct, if animals pause because performing the response has made them tired, then we should see short pauses at points C and E, because again, the animal has just completed these short ratios at those 2 points. But again, that's not what happens. The pauses that we see there are quite long. So again, the length of the pause does not seem to depend on the size of the just completed ratio, which casts serious doubt on the fatigue hypothesis. But the length of the pause does seem to depend on the size of the upcoming ratio. So as you can see here, whenever the light is red, whenever it's being signaled to the animal that the shorter FR10 schedule is in effect, there the animal doesn't take much of a pause, even if it's just worked really hard, like it has at point A and point D. And whenever the light is blue, whenever it's being signaled to the animal that the longer fixed ratio schedule is in effect, then the animal takes a much longer pause, even if it hasn't just worked really hard, like at point C and point E. And so, guys, findings like these are definitely more in line with the procrastination idea, right? They're more in line with the remaining responses hypothesis than they are with the fatigue hypothesis. And for that reason, some people prefer nowadays to use the term pre ratio pause instead of the more traditional post reinforcement pause. I do still tend to call them post reinforcement pauses because I think that's still the more common term. But honestly, pre ratio pause probably does make more sense because, again, the research suggests that it's the size of the upcoming ratio. It's the amount of work ahead and not the amount of work you've just done that seems to cause these pauses. Okay, well, I hope that makes sense. But if you have any questions about fixed ratio schedules or those pauses that we see on fixed ratio schedules, then please let me know. Okay, take care.